Welcome back, everybody. Episode 19 of Just Conversations. Just Conversations. I've just lost it. It's early in the morning. Systemic solution-focused communication with the goal of informing systemic change. And as always, my next guest needs no introduction. Over to you, Terrance.
Hi, everyone. My name is Professor Terrence Coffie from New York University. I am one of the leading advocates here in the United States addressing criminal justice reform. I'm also the founder of the Social Justice Network that focuses on creating a more viable and equitable system of reentry here in the States. And a lot of my work really focuses in on that area in addressing systemic issues as it relates to the criminal legal system.
Thank you, Terrance.
Yes, absolutely.
No, I've known you for a little while now. I was lucky enough to meet you when I come to New York, which was, really nice to connect in person with someone. So the work that you're doing at the moment, and I was really interested when I got to New York because marijuana had just been legalized there. So
Yes.
how have you seen things change in that justice space around? Are there less people going to jail? Are there more people? You're trying to get some people out. Like, where does that sit at the moment around that change systemically in language, essentially, from being legal to not legal?
Well, I think that the first thing to kind of really focus on is the fact that here in the United States, cannabis has not been legalized at the federal level. However, it has been dropped down to, I think, to a Schedule I narcotics, which removes it as a dangerous drug as it relates to cocaine or heroin or some of the, what we like to say, the hard drugs. And with that, I think that that's pretty much precipitous to the legalization at the federal level. Now, at the state level, that's very different because some states, including New York, has focused on the legalization that happened this year. As far as when we think about the equity within this system at this point, we have a program which is called the Social Equity Program that's focusing on addressing some of those systemic challenges, as well as the impact that anti-cannabis enforcement has had on, particularly in Black and Brown communities. As you may know, African Americans and Latinos in America represented the highest number of those individuals that were arrested for cannabis possession or consumption. And since that time, that legislation with the MRTA has set forth the process of expungement. For me and the work that I'm doing with the Cannabis Justice Equity Initiative, one of the challenges that we felt had to be addressed was the fact that if we're looking at the demographics or communities that have been disproportionately impacted by anti-cannabis enforcement, the idea of expunging a person's record solely for cannabis does not remove the stigma as it relates to a lot of the other issues when we think about the lack of employment, the lack of housing, the lack of education, the lack of voting rights, et cetera, et cetera. So we've encouraged our state legislatures here to take that a step further, which is why we developed the Justice Arm, the Justice Lab, which will work directly with those individuals here in the state of New York to address some of those other issues, as well as providing a pathway to employment opportunity within the cannabis industry and couch more of a restorative justice approach for the same product that caused this harm. We can utilize the same product to provide opportunities, which is why we launched the Cannabis Justice Equity Initiative training program, which is a 16-week program that trains those individuals who have justice involvement in the space of cannabis up and down what we call the vertical line. So those conversations have been moving forward. However, there is still the overall challenges that we face for any individual with justice involvement as it relates to the scarlet letter or the perpetual punishment, as we say, as they continue to try to establish their lives within a system that's still very opposed to some of the things and values that you and I believe in, and some of your listeners.
Yeah, I think the word that stuck out for me then, and I relate to, is the perpetual punishment, which is,
Yes.
as someone that has been formerly incarcerated, for the language that your listeners will use, the perpetual punishment that I've experienced since I've been released is obviously something I wasn't aware of, but you know, still it feels like at times 20 years later. You know, I'm feeling it a bit at the moment around lived experience and trying to get into certain spaces. And it seems like people with lived experience still need academia here, it feels like. So just the barriers, I'm interested to learn a bit more, because as you said, the barriers are still there. So the expungement, can you just unpack the expungement so I can understand that a little bit better, what that means?
Okay, well, in relations to this conversation, an expungement, as it's defined here in New York State, is the idea that a person who has a, let's say, marijuana conviction, that charge would be essentially wiped away from their record, which would then, allow them supposedly to be able to move on with their lives. However, you cannot isolate one expungement based upon a marijuana conviction when we're looking at these communities, because, the likelihood, and I think that a lot of times in these conversations, when we say words like expungement, the clearing of someone's record, when we talk about this, I think that we forget the systemic engagement or impact that the criminal legal system has as a whole. When we talk about low-level offenses, when we're talking about, because you may get caught with marijuana, but also you have a trespassing, you may have this, you may have all that. All this is what we call compounded convictions. Yeah. So a person goes in for having marijuana, they may have 5 other charges tied to just that one arrest. And if we think about this as a whole, this is where the perpetual punishment comes in. So we can expunge the marijuana charge, but we still got 20 other charges that may prohibit that person from engaging in, the practice or being a part of our societal structures when it comes to employment, when it comes to voting, when it comes to these things. And I think that's something you just mentioned that's very important for our listeners to understand. We're talking about people who have paid their debts to society. We're talking about the idea, if I have paid my debt to society, why am I 20 years later having something that happened 20 years ago still affect my ability to move forward as a citizen? For instance, here in the United States, in the state of Florida, they have over 70, I think it's 70 million people with criminal convictions who cannot vote. So when we think of that, we have to ask ourselves, what does that mean for our democratic process in our voting? How are we truly hearing the voices of those constituents within our states or our communities? And I think that is going to be another interesting conversation for your listeners, and particularly as happening here in the United States, is that we have now had a former president who has been convicted of 34 felonies, however, and he can still run for president. So you need to know that there are conversations that are being held like, wait a minute, but we have 44,000 barriers against us, and this guy can still run for president.
He can run for president, but he can't vote for himself? Is that true?
He can't vote for himself, but he can run for president, and he's a resident of the city. So this is the challenge, and but seriously, this is what we call, we refer to as the two criminal legal systems that exist in America. One for those minorities, and then that's those for Americans. And this is what's playing out right before our very eyes. So I'm looking, I've been following this very closely. We're looking at how this is going to impact the voting rights in America as a whole, as well as readdress some of the most critical issues as it relates to our criminal legal system, not only here in the United States, but also abroad. And I'm sure that you have a lot of insight on the comparisons of the Aboriginal or the First Nations people in your country. In that, I was looking at a report that showed the similarities between how the criminal legal system impacts the lives of those individuals as minorities. So that's another conversation I think that's going to be very interesting as we move forward and continue to indulge in this new era of politics here in the United States.
Yeah. And so, me being white and privileged, I'll never shy away from that. So yeah, you're right. Our First Nations population is 3% of our entire population. They make up to like 38-40%. In some states and territories in the juvenile system are 100% of the prison population, which is just like, it's wrong,
Ridiculous,
disgusting. It's systemic racism. It's everything that you know and understand from your experience and your system as well. And it's I believe it has a lot to do with poverty. And obviously, systemically, we put these people and, or the minorities into those poverty situations, and then, ongoing.
Yeah, and I think that's similar to what's happening there in Australia, are the racial undertones that that dictate how these systems operate within our society. And I just think that when we think of individuals such as yourself who are privileged, who have been impacted, I think that your voice becomes one of the most important voices in this space to help highlight and bring awareness to this space. One of our dear friends, Glenn Martin, shared that those closest to the problem are also those closest to the solution. So I think that
fathers from the resources
and power.
He always says to me, "You gotta say that last bit, brother."
Yeah, we have to say that last piece. And I usually say that first part, and I get in more intimate conversations because that's the most critical part. And I think that platforms like Just Conversations with Dean Lloyd provide that atmosphere for us to have, I think, very intimate conversations to really educate our communities and societies on some of those challenges and barriers that impact these populations here in both our respective countries. I just penned a letter in my recent article in Forbes to President Joe Biden calling for the repeal of the 94 crime bill here in the United States, which, again, similar to some of the laws there in Australia that disproportionately targeted, arrested, and incarcerated those poor African Americans, Latinos in this country, and led to what we now have as mass incarceration. So again, having these conversations on an international platform, I think really reflects the commitment of who you are, and it gauges, I think, the temperature of our society to be able to engage, really engage in conversations to create a more equitable system of justice.
And well, that's the thing is, and what I say to a lot of people here is, what it appears to happen in the US is they kill black and brown people in public. Whereas in Australia, they take them to prison and then they kill them. So there's a death in custody here where, there can almost be a death every month in custody over here. And our prison population is like 40,000. So it's not nowhere near what yours is. But you can imagine that every week there's an Aboriginal person, female and male, that are being killed in custody. And what that does to ripple out into those communities. Around trusting, even like, so they don't call the police here. Obviously, you understand why they don't call. So over here, Indigenous people are really reluctant to call the police, not because they're going to get killed in public, but they know that if they take that away, and we've had a guy that, I can't breathe, exactly the same sentence that
Yeah,
you
I was looking
experienced
at
over
I
there?
was looking at the a documentary last night surrounding the death of George Floyd. And it's very interesting that you shared about that lack of trust. And just so we know that it's not a national thing or or anything of that nature, it's really a human response to some of the challenges that these people face, because that same lack of trust still is embedded into the construct of Black and brown communities, particularly poor Black and brown communities across this country. The lack of the inability or that lack of trust of wanting to call the police, or wanting or being in fear that if you get pulled over, there's a high chance of you possibly being murdered. And I think that, again, um, these are all indications of a society that I think that we're headed to a space of evolution or revolution, where we really begin to have these collective conversations to begin to see the comparisons on some of the challenges. Like you said, for you guys there in Australia, it's the idea of being arrested and knowing that you could possibly be murdered. And for here in the United States, it's just the idea of being Black, being, driving or this or walking, whatever that looks like. So we're, there's there has been, I want to say, but I'm always reluctant. I think that there have been strides made by the Biden-Harris administration and the Justice Department to really begin to highlight some of the discrepancies within police practices here in the United States, particularly as it relates to Black and brown communities. I think that technology has really began to play an intricate role, because now everything is filmed. But also be clear that we also know we can all look at something and somehow people are found not guilty regarding some of these challenges. But I do think there is a greater social involvement from society as it relates to this conversation and many others, when we're talking about forms of discrimination. And we're seeing that through movements like the Me Too movement, the rise of the LGBTQ community, and other rights with other groups that are really, I think, that are really fueling this new consciousness of us as a society, and again, not just here now. And I think that this is from a world lens, where we're all looking and beginning to see some of these challenges that face us as a society.
And I'm glad you touched on it, brought it up. So I believe we're undergoing an innovative evolution at the moment with the technology. People are seeing, and people are able to see stuff in real time. My parents are my greatest critics on this. They watch this every Saturday morning. And my mum's like, you could be a little bit less excited and stop interrupting your guests. So, that said, like, my parents, they don't know about this stuff. So I'm trying to get to the ears, I don't want to preach to the choir. I want to get to the ears of people that don't know, and they're like, oh yeah, that's like someone else, and we don't know that person. I want to get to the upper middle class white ears, if you will, to say, hey, this is still going on. This is still happening. Like in Australia, they're still removing Indigenous children at birth from hospitals so that the government are coming in and just taking them away without telling them. Because
wow.
A while ago, we had a white Australia policy. We had a policy where it was white Australia. So and the lingering nature of that policy, a lot of Australians don't understand that that's still happening today, because they think, oh yeah, that doesn't happen anymore. But yeah, they're still at the same rate as they were in like 1970 and all that sort of stuff, removing First Nations babies and coming into hospital, not telling them and going, oh, both of your parents, you've been on drugs and you've been in jail, so we need to take in the best interest of your child, remove it.
Right. I've read a few reports that really kind of highlighted what you just shared, that a lot of those laws were actually passed with, are being, individuals and communities, particularly in Australia, are being controlled by the criminal legal system under the guise of protection. And I think that it's important that as we have these conversations, that one of the things that we learned from history is that history teaches us a lesson. And there are times I think that, we think that we're in 2024, so some of these draconian practices could not be taking place, because that's speaking to the humanity of your audience, to believe that, hey, this cannot be happening. But yet and still, some of these practices are still being perpetrated in our society. And I think it goes back to the importance of platforms such as this that continues to educate the general society on right where we're at. For me, when you say the white laws there in Australia, we still have aspects of what we call Jim Crow. We think, well, hey, that stuff doesn't go on anymore, but yet and still, we still see the ongoing practices of this more covert, as we like to say, but for those communities.
Yeah.
And those individuals that see this every day, that's outside of the media spotlight, or when we're not in those communities when these things happen. And I think that our voices on the front lines play a very critical role in raising awareness surrounding some of the practices that still continue today.
And if you really think about it, you understand justice involvement. Once you get sort of into the system, it's so hard to extricate yourself out of it. So if at birth, put into that system, and the ongoing transgenerational trauma and the impacts and the ripple effects that has, and over here, essentially it's colonization. So that's the long-lasting, lingering effects of colonization.
Yeah, and what you described is when we talk about generational trauma, we talk about these generational practices that are handed down from one generation to the next. And for us, it's very clear when we're thinking about some of the new voting laws that were passed here in the United States. It goes back to the very same practices, where I think they just recently repealed the idea of you can't give, if you have people who are standing on line, you could be arrested for giving them water. You can be arrested for supporting them with food. You can be arrested. And those are some of those ongoing practices that we've seen in the past that continue to impact voting rights here in America for African Americans. That's just one aspect. As we look at our criminal legal system, we call it legalized lynching in America, and what's happening within our criminal legal system, that the over incarceration, over sentencing of Black and brown folk for the same exact crimes. Again, I think that a lot of these practices have been more covert, are more covert today, as opposed to being blatantly hanging you from a tree, as opposed to what we're seeing now, because it's still having, as you said, the same ripple impact on those communities and our society as a whole.
Yeah, and you touched on it a bit before, just around me being white and privileged and all that sort of stuff. However, my experience is division is the enemy, and like together we can. Like the more that people can divide, our thoughts and our communications, and that's part of what Just Conversations is about. Is hey, we may disagree on certain points, and we have an end goal where we don't believe in incarceration. We don't feel that prison, in my opinion, as we know it, is barbaric, antiquated, violent, and obsolete, unable to solve the problems of a healthy, happy, humane society. Yeah. So we believe on that, and that's sort of okay. But as we move along and we have points of difference, the people that can come in and wedge that divide between us. So if we're arguing, they're winning.
Yeah, exactly.
Division is
that's more. Yeah, it's like the more so the divide and conquer theory, particularly among social advocates, because as you said, there are going to be a lot of differences, and this is what a lot of my work here has now led me into having. Here in the United States, we have an old saying that politics makes strange bedfellows. Which, like now here in the United States, we have what we call progressive district attorneys or progressive DAs, which are now looking at the scope of justice from a very different lens. And you're right. I think that we're not going to agree on everything. Even my relationships with law enforcement agencies, my relationships with district attorney's offices, my relationships with several of our judicial courts here in the United States. There are parameters in which we all believe, but I do think that there's a common interest that we share that allows me, like you said, I don't want to preach to the audience. So it's important that we're having these conversations in some of those spaces that 25, 30 years ago, we wouldn't normally be in, because there has been a social, I think, shift in the way we're seeing justice, in the way justice is being meted. Now that we have some new partners at the table that understand that. And I think that one of the most important things that we can do collectively is when we come to the first is to come to the table, but actually also the next step is to find our common goals. What are our common goals that we can work for together that reflects the equity within justice that I think that we all truly believe in, and represents the best of our humanity in our society. And that's where I'm at in my work. And sometimes, again, I can be on any side of the coin of advocacy, because I think that, you know, sometimes my work is mistaken. I am not anti-law enforcement. I am not anti prisons. I'm not none of the things. But what I do believe in is an equitable system of justice that speaks to the humanity of those individuals, particularly when we know that 77% of those individuals are going to be returning home. And I think that we have a responsibility as a society in the name of public safety to ensure that we're addressing those underlying issues and needs, whether that's poverty, mental health, racial tensions, et cetera, that we have a responsibility, because at the end, what we want, I believe, is a society that's whole and that represents the best of who we are as a whole, you know, as a whole. So our investment within our criminal legal system to that population gives us an opportunity to reflect the moral compass of who we are as a people.
Yeah. And I definitely think there's appetite now in society for that sort of change. They understand that putting people in cages and treating them terribly is not going to get the results that we want and we desire. And, you know, as you mentioned before, Glenn and I always say, may we never agree. Because if we agree, nothing's going to be getting changed. Nothing's moving forward. So like the respect in disagreement, that's part of this just conversations scenario. Is like we can respectfully disagree on things. I'm noticing our time's getting close to an end.
Yeah, I see it.
Question that
right when we're getting into the meat and potato.
The question that I always ask people is, what brings you joy, and how do you bring joy in your life so then you can like fill your cup up and give it to other people? Like, where does joy come for you?
Well, I think that, you know, the greatest joy that I have in the work that I do after spending over 19 years incarcerated myself is the opportunity to speak from a platform and teach from a platform at an institution such as New York University. But I think the second step for me, where the greatest joy that I receive is seeing young minds and young students that are committed to the idea and vision of an equitable society, and their commitment to get involved in this work, and their commitment to create change. And just for your audience to know that I'm also on faculty with our New York University's prison education program, where today, after spending over 19 years incarcerated, I actually go back in prisons and to teach social work 101 and social policy, where now my work now is to empower future leaders of tomorrow who have that lived experience. And to see those young men come out of those cages and become activists, to see these individuals come out to be thought leaders, to see these young men come out to be mentors to others in their communities, and in this work that you and I are spearheading, that just brings me the greatest joy, because for you and I, as you know, that we're living off, and we exist today because of the advocates who came before us, So I think that responsibility that, the work that we're doing is going to be paving the way for those future advocates who are going to come after us, and to be in this space and in this time, being a part of these conversations is more rewarding to me than anything that I can possibly think of.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Because, I get disillusioned and I get, oh, no. But when I have these conversations with people like you and other people, it inspires me. I'm like, yeah, I got to get back, I want to do this work and I want to be involved in this work, because it can be really, at times, arduous, frustrating, and lonely, because you're just like, I feel like I'm just out here on my own doing this, and no one agrees with me, and I want this and I want that. So yeah, it can be, thank you for helping fill up my cup today. That's what I want to say.
Well, I want to thank you for helping fill up my cup and the work that's taking place here. Again, I think that we are living in some very interesting times. I think that a lot of the international crises are really providing us an opportunity as human beings first, to really begin to look at how do we see this work through the eyes of humanity. How do we see this work through the eyes of social justice and human rights? And I think that becomes that line of understanding what you mentioned earlier, where we find those common values that we believe in, and we build around those collectively. And so as you continue to do the work there, on behalf of the Aboriginal people, and as well as in the vein of social equity and justice, that work continues here. So please do not, I want to say that I pray that you never falter in this, because your work is also impacting the lives of over 2.3 million people who are incarcerated here in the United States, and over 80.9 million people with criminal convictions here in the United States. So the more you and I and your audience begin to engage in these conversations, it becomes something much larger than what's happening in Australia or is happening in the US, but it becomes an international discourse on social justice and equity, and what that means and what that should look like in real practice and real time for all of us, as we're committed to this idea of social justice and social equity. And that's not just, related to the criminal legal system. That's that's focused in the rights of others. That's focused in the rights of minorities. That's focused in the right. That's across, as we said, that's systemic. So we're having a new narrative and a new conversation based on those principles and values and morals that we set forth that are at the heart of the work that you and I do.
Yeah, thank you, Terrance. And I've done a fellowship recently last year, or when I come to meet you. But what I've taken away from that is, how can I introduce humane practices into environments that are trauma-inducing to increase instances of joy and hope? Because when I'm without hope, no, but I don't want to be around myself. So, like, how can we increase these instances? And I think hope is one of the greatest things that gets missed in these conversations at times. Aware, you've got maybe a minute. If you want to spruik anything, sell anything, tell us about anything. I know it's like not a lot of time. It goes really quickly. I enjoy it. But yeah, is there anything you're working on that you really want someone to know about at the moment?
Yeah. Well, right now we're at the forefront of having conversations with the New York State Department of Corrections and introducing the Reentry Assistance Program, where the Social Justice Network will be going inside correctional institutions to really begin to support those individuals who are coming home. And also, we're launching our Comic Books for Justice initiative here in New York that focuses on literacy and education within the criminal legal system. So for any of your listeners or those in Australia who want to get involved, you can follow us at the Social Justice Network, sjnus.org. Get involved. Give a contribution, donate some comic books, but also definitely get involved in creating change. And we have a host of things that we're doing there that provides that opportunity.
Once again, Terrance, as always, thank you for your time. Really love your passion. Really love your spirit. Thank you again. Dean from Down Under, over and out.
Over and out.